guys, and welcome to Coding for Kids. Today we are going to be looking at the different types of CSS selectors. So we learned about the CSS rule and the CSS syntax in the last video. So if you didn't check that out, go check that out. But today we are going to be learning about the CSS selector types. So let's get right into it. So first, I'm just going to go over the overview of this video. So we are going to be looking at the selector types, and there are 5 types of selectors. The element selector, the ID selector, the class selector, the group selector, and the universal selector. Then we're going to be going over a property that is very common in CSS, and then finally we're going to be doing some coding. So let's go into the video. So what is a selector? So a CSS selector is used to select a HTML element you want to style. CSS selectors are part of the CSS rule. Again, that is in my last video. There are 5 types of CSS selectors: the element selector, the ID selector, the class selector, the group selector, and the universal selector. So let's look at the element selector. So this is probably the most common. So the element selector will select a HTML element based on the name of the element. For example, let's say you want to style your heading, your h1 heading. What you would do is you would type in h1, and then you would put some curly braces, and then you would put whatever CSS you want in it. So this is an element selector when you just say the name of the HTML element. Now, a ID selector. So the ID attribute selects the ID given to a HTML element. So the ID selector kind of has like a 2-step process. So basically what you would do is in the opening tag of whatever you want to style. For example, this is a paragraph. You would put the ID attribute. So ID equal to, in quotation marks, whatever name or whatever ID you want to give it. In this case, they put alt. So they just you need to put some quotation marks, and then you would put like alt or something, or whatever name you want. And then what you would do is when you're doing your CSS, what you would do is you would put a hashtag in front of the ID. So you wouldn't just put alt, you would put hashtag alt. And this is how you call it ID. This is only unique to an ID. And then what you would do is you would put the CSS code. So one thing to note about the ID selector, an ID can only be given to one HTML element. You can't give it to multiple elements. The ID needs to be unique to the HTML document. So basically what that means is you can't give the same alt ID to any other element. It needs to be different. So that's the ID selector. So now let's look at the class selector. The class selector selects an element using the special attribute called class attribute. So you can see right here, just like the ID attribute, there's a class attribute. So class equal to, in quotation marks, whatever you want. In this case, they said blue, and this will tell what which class to use to style. Now what you would do is when you're doing your CSS, instead of putting a hashtag, you would put a period or a dot. And then you would type in your class name. Then you would do your CSS. So the difference between an ID selector and a class selector is first, a class uses a period. But second is that the class can be given to multiple HTML elements. So that means you could give this to a h1 heading, you could give this to a paragraph, you could give this to a link, you could give this to a h2 heading. You could give this to multiple HTML elements, while the ID selector, you can only give it to one HTML element. So now let's look at the group selector. The group selector is used when you want to style multiple HTML elements. So you can see right here, let's say you want the same CSS for multiple elements. What you would do is you would put commas between each HTML element's name. For example, h1, comma, h2, comma, p, or a paragraph. So this is how the group selector works. It's just when you want to style multiple HTML elements. Now finally we have the universal selector. The universal selector selects all the elements in your HTML document using the asterisk mark. So this means it'll select every single element. You can't choose, oh, I want this, I want that. It chooses every single thing in your HTML document. And what you do is, instead of using like the group selector, or instead of naming each like different element, you would just put an asterisk mark. So this selects all the elements in your HTML file or document, and then you would put whatever CSS you want. So this is the universal selector. So now the color property. So probably throughout this whole slideshow, you've been seeing the color property. You can see it right here. 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 You can even see it right there. So it's been throughout this whole slideshow. So what is the color property? So the color property is used to add color to HTML elements. This property is mostly used for setting the background color and the font color of an element. So there are two ways to set the color property, or there are two ways to set a color for any HTML element. The first is the RGBA format. So RGBA stands for red, green, blue, and alpha. So usually you might be thinking, wait, why is green here? Why not yellow? Well, in the computer, instead of like the primary colors being red, green, or red, yellow, and blue, it's red, green, and blue. So this is a little bit different, but this is how computer understands it. So you can define a color by simply setting a value to each color. So this might make more sense later in the slideshow. So this shows how much red, green, or blue you want in the color. You can set the value from a range of 0 to 225. So this will make more sense when we look at the images and examples and stuff. So alpha. So I said right here, red, green, blue, and alpha. So what is A? What does alpha mean? So alpha means how much like transparency you want in your color. So this ranges from 0 to 1, and 0 is fully transparent, where basically you can't see the color, and 1 is not transparent at all. It's at its full opacity. So now that was the RGBA format. Now let's look at the hexadecimal notation. So this is the second way of setting a color. So the hexadecimal notation can be represented by 6 numbers and letters. Before these 6 characters starting from 0 to F is a hashtag. So what you would do is you would put hashtag and then whatever 6 numbers you want, or letters. So in the hexadecimal notation, the first 2 digits represent red, the second 2 represent green, and the last 2 represent blue. So you can kind of see the red, green, blue in like both, even though they're totally different ways of representing color, they still have some similarities. So you can see right here, this will make a little bit more sense. So the first are red, the second are green, and the last are blue. So you can see how much of each color you want. And you can see right here, there are some examples. And then for the RGBA format, what you would do is the first number represents green, and then you would put a comma. The first represents red, the second represents green, the third represents blue, and then this is the alpha. So they put 1 here, which means it's at its full opacity. So now let's get coding. So we're going to go to Codeorg and click on the web lab. And now it's time to experiment with selectors. So I've already done some code with some different types of selectors. So we're just going to be going over it and how we would use each selector. So I'm going to go to Codeorg and let's get right into it. So guys, we are here in Codeorg. So you can see right here, I've created some paragraphs and some headings and stuff. So I have linked our CSS file right here, you can see. And then right here, you can see we have a h2 heading that says selectors. Now it says a little bit about some of the selectors. Then we have our element selector, and then our paragraph. Then we have our ID selector and our class selector. So let's go into the CSS. So you can see right here, first we have our universal selector, and we just put an asterisk mark. So an example for using the universal selector could be adding the background color, because you want the background color to be like through the whole document. You don't want it to stop in between or something. So this is one reason why we would use the universal selector, because some people are like, why, this is not going to be that useful, but there are a few uses for the universal selector. Now we have the element selector. This is probably very common. You might have seen this before. So it's just putting like H2 and P. So you can see right here, our H2 heading has it, and then you can see right here, all the paragraphs that don't have special code are yellow. So now you can see our class selector. You can see we've added a period, so that means it's a class selector. And our class selector, if you see right here, we've put class equal to color for 3 HTML elements. We put it for the H3 heading, we put it for the paragraph, and we put it for the division tag. So this can be for multiple elements. So we just put dot color. We didn't need to put 3 different HTML headings or 3 different HTML selectors. We just did it in one. Now we have our color. So you can see right here, this is a class selector. Now an ID selector, you'll see that the ID is only given to one element. We didn't put it for multiple elements because you can't do that. So you can see right here, ID equal to ID heading and ID equal to ID paragraph. So you can see they're totally different. They're not the same. So that's why you can see right here, we added them separately. So these are ID selectors. Then we have our group selector. So you can see right here, we just put some commas so it's styled, multiple HTML elements. So these are the selector types. So now I'm going to go back to the slideshow so we can review and see what we've learned. So guys, basically, let's just review really quickly. So we learned about the element selector, which is the most common selector. Then we learned about the ID selector, which is the one that has a hashtag. Then we learned about the class selector, which is a dot or the period. And then the group selector, which you can add multiple HTML elements. And the universal selector, which selects the whole HTML document. Then we learned about the color property. So now, and we also did some coding. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video because CSS is very important in this different types of selectors, because we won't always use the element selector. We won't always use that. We'll use multiple selectors, and some are easier than others. In some cases, the group selector might be very important. In some cases, the ID selector is very important. So, all the selectors are important, so just practicing them is very helpful, and soon enough you'll be using all of these. So yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe and like and comment down below what you want to see more of, maybe CSS, maybe HTML. So just comment down below your thoughts. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.